The dim hallway of the Washington, D.C. motel was always quiet. A place of stillness broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps or the soft buzz of the old fluorescent lights. It was 1994, and Seal, a refugee from Vietnam, had worked there for almost 3 years. Every day, she cleaned the same rooms, made the same beds, and went about her business without much thought. The job wasn't glamorous, but it kept the bills paid. She worked hard, not only for herself, but to build a life in a country where she knew no one. But there was one suite that always made her uneasy. The top floor suite, where the most expensive room in the motel stood. No one knew much about the guest who stayed there, but there were whispers. His name, Mr. M, was never accompanied by a last name. He checked in and out without a word to anyone. The staff never saw him leave his suite, never saw him interact with anyone. He paid in cash, always. It was as if he didn't exist beyond the 4 walls of that room. On that particular Tuesday morning, Seal was assigned to clean that very suite. It wasn't the first time, but today felt different. As she stood at the door, the air was thick with something she couldn't place. Something was wrong. She hesitated, but then pushed the thought aside. She had a job to do. The manager had made it clear. It didn't matter who stayed in that suite. It was her responsibility to clean it. The keycard slid easily into the lock, and the door opened with a slight creak. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but there was an odd sense of warmth to it, as though the air had been thick with something else for days. Seal stepped inside, the carpet squishing beneath her feet. The bed was perfectly made, the furniture undisturbed, but there was something in the corner of the room, something that made her heart skip a beat. A small wooden box, placed carefully on the polished dresser. A chill ran down her spine. She turned away, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but her curiosity gnawed at her. She walked over to the dresser. The box was old, dusty, with a small latch that appeared to have been opened recently. It was strange, but nothing in this room had ever been normal. With trembling hands, Seal lifted the lid. Inside, there was a clump of hair. Blood-stained and matted, it lay in the box like something that belonged in a nightmare. She recoiled, gasping, the scent of copper and decay filling her nostrils. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The hair? It wasn't just bloodied, it looked fresh, as if someone had been brutally hurt only hours before. Her stomach turned. She stumbled back, her hands shaking violently. Seal had seen violence in her life, but nothing had ever prepared her for this. The door behind her creaked, and she spun around. Her heart stopped. The room was empty, but she could feel the presence of someone, something, lingering in the shadows. The same feeling she had felt when she first stepped into the suite crept over her again, stronger now. A whisper of something dark, something not human. Seal didn't know how long she stood frozen, staring at that box. It felt like time had stopped, the air thick with an unspoken dread. Then her mind finally snapped into action. She grabbed the box, slammed the lid shut, and bolted from the room. The keycard slipped from her hand as she fumbled to lock the door. She didn't care about protocol. She didn't care about her job anymore. She needed to leave. The manager was already gone by the time Seal reached the office. She didn't stop to explain. She didn't even take off her uniform. She just left, walking out into the cool night air, not daring to look back. The building, the suite, the smell of blood, it all haunted her. She never returned to that motel, never spoke a word about what she had found. It wasn't until months later that the news broke. A movie worker, a woman who had gone missing weeks before, was found dead. Her body was discovered in an abandoned apartment on the outskirts of the city. But what made the case more chilling was that the police found clumps of hair scattered around the room. The hair was an exact match to what Seal had seen in the box. The authorities had no leads, they had no suspects, but Seal knew. The dark presence that had lingered in that suite, the silence of Mr. M, and the horrifying discovery, it all made sense now. Mr. M was not just a guest. He was something far worse, and Seal had narrowly escaped his grasp. For years after, Seal couldn't shake the memory of that room. the feeling of being watched, the smell, the sight of that box. She had quit the motel that night, never to return, but the terror stayed with her. Every dark corner, every shadow, she knew something more sinister lurked in the world, and she would never be the same again. It was a dark and stormy night when Nathaniel found himself driving down a long stretch of highway, the rain pounding relentlessly against the windshield. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the wipers struggled to clear the endless stream of water. Tired, frustrated, and on the verge of falling asleep at the wheel, Nathaniel squinted through the misty glass, looking for anything that could provide a brief respite from the long drive. The highway seemed deserted, the kind of place that felt abandoned, with no signs of life for miles. Then, just as he thought he couldn't go on any longer, he saw it, a faded, weather-beaten sign by the side of the road. Sunset Motel. The letters were barely visible, their paint chipped and peeling, but it was enough for Nathaniel. He needed a place to sleep, even if it was a hole in the wall. He could worry about the rest in the morning. He pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. The motel was a dilapidated structure, lit only by a flickering neon light. As he stepped out of the car, a chill ran down his spine, though it wasn't from the cold. There was something off about the place, a feeling that clung to the air like the dampness from the storm. The front door opened with a squeak, and an elderly man appeared in the doorway, his thin lips curling into an unsettling smile. "You here for a room?" The man's voice was low, almost too soft, and his eyes lingered on Nathaniel for longer than was comfortable. Nathaniel nodded, too tired to question his instincts. "Yeah, just for the night." The man led him down a narrow hallway, the flickering lights above casting long, twisting shadows. The room was simple enough, but something about it felt wrong. The walls were stained with mildew, and the old-fashioned furniture creaked under the weight of time. Still, Nathaniel was too exhausted to care. He locked the door behind him, stripped off his wet clothes, and crawled into the bed, the damp sheets cool against his skin. He tried to shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but the exhaustion won out, and he drifted off to sleep. Hours later, he awoke to the sound of hushed voices outside his room. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again. Low, murmuring voices, like two people trying to be discreet. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. He sat up in bed, the room still dark except for the faint glow of the motel's flickering neon sign. He cautiously moved to the window and peeked through the blinds. What he saw sent a wave of terror through him. Standing outside, under the pale light of the motel sign, were the old man and another figure, a tall man with dark hair and a long coat. They were talking in low, urgent voices, looking over their shoulders as if they were expecting someone to be watching them. Nathaniel's blood ran cold when he realized they were looking directly at his window, as though they could see through the curtains. His heart pounded in his chest. What were they doing? Why were they out there? Just then, the two men turned and began walking toward his room. They stopped just outside his door, and Nathaniel could hear the unmistakable sound of the lock turning. The door creaked open, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. He forced himself to take a deep breath and back away from the window. They were searching for something, or someone. Nathaniel's mind raced. Could it be him they were after? What did they want? The door shut and the sounds of footsteps faded. Nathaniel didn't waste a second. He grabbed his things, threw on his clothes, and silently unlocked the door, making sure to avoid any noise that might alert them. He slipped into the darkness of the hallway, his heart pounding as he moved toward the back exit. Outside, the storm had intensified, but he didn't care. Nathaniel sprinted to his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his keys. He didn't even look back at the motel as he started the engine and sped away, tires screeching against the wet road. He drove for miles, not stopping until he was sure he had left the motel, and whatever danger it held, far behind. The next morning, Nathaniel was still shaken. He found a diner and sat down with a cup of coffee, trying to calm his nerves. As he scanned the morning newspaper, his eyes froze on a headline. Sunset Motel shut down in human trafficking bust. His stomach dropped as he read further. Owner arrested. The man he had met, the one who seemed so unsettling, was part of a dark operation. The authorities had found evidence of multiple crimes, all tied to the rundown motel. Nathaniel felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced with a gut-wrenching realization. He had narrowly escaped. Had he stayed any longer, he might not have made it out at all. He pushed the newspaper away, taking one last shuddering breath. He had no doubt the Sunset Motel had been a trap, and he had been just another unwitting victim. Kara had been driving for hours. The road stretched endlessly in front of her, a dark ribbon through the vast, lonely countryside. Her car's headlights barely cut through the thick blanket of night. She had hoped to reach her destination before the storm hit, but now the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming relentlessly against the roof of her car. There was nothing but the occasional flash of lightning to break the monotony. The only sign of life for miles was a small, rundown motel that appeared like a ghost in the distance. Kara didn't want to stop. She had no intention of staying at a place like that, cheap, isolated, and unsettling. But the storm had worsened, and she was exhausted. She needed rest, and the motel was the only option for miles. She pulled her car into the empty parking lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. The building loomed in front of her like a decaying monument to a forgotten past. It was old, with cracked windows and peeling paint. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its light flickering as though struggling to stay on. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of mildew. A tired-looking woman behind the counter greeted Kara with a blank expression. "One room for the night?" she asked, not bothering with small talk. Kara nodded, eager to get out of the rain. The woman handed her a key, its metal surface cold and tarnished. "Room 13, at the far end of the hall," she said, her voice flat. Kara felt a shiver run down her spine, but she attributed it to exhaustion. Room 13, of course. It felt too much like a cliché, but she couldn't afford to be picky. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering overhead light casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper. Kara's footsteps echoed in the silence as she made her way to the room. When she opened the door, the smell hit her immediately. Stale air, like the room hadn't been opened in years. The bed was unmade, the sheets wrinkled and old. The curtains were drawn tightly, blocking any hint of moonlight from outside. She couldn't even see the storm through the windows, only darkness. Kara stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Something didn't feel right. She wasn't sure if it was the silence or the heaviness in the air, but she felt an overwhelming sense of unease settle over her. She locked the door behind her, hoping that might give her some comfort. She sat on the edge of the bed, then lay down, pulling the thin blanket over her. As she closed her eyes, trying to block out the growing sense of dread, the quiet was interrupted. A rustling sound. It came from the far corner of the room. Kara's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just the wind or the creaking of the building settling. But then, it happened again. The sound of something moving in the shadows. Slowly, Kara turned her head towards the corner, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but she saw it. A figure. At first, it was nothing more than a shape, but as her vision sharpened, she realized the shape was standing at the foot of the bed. It had no face. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, draped in what looked like a tattered cloak that blended into the shadows. But there was something wrong. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her. Kara's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but the sound lodged in her chest, trapped by the terror that gripped her. She wanted to turn away, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her legs were frozen, rooted to the bed. The figure took a step forward, and then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. Kara's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she scrambled to get out of bed, her limbs shaking with the effort. She tore her eyes away from the figure and bolted for the door. Her hands fumbled with the lock, her fingers slick with sweat. The door swung open with a creak, and Kara didn't hesitate. She ran. The rain lashed at her as she dashed across the parking lot, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't look back, not even once. She reached her car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut behind her. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, she sped off, the headlights cutting through the storm as she left the motel behind. But even as she drove away, the image of the faceless figure lingered in her mind. The terror in its eyes, or rather, the lack of eyes, the feeling that it had been watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Kara never returned to that motel. She couldn't bring herself to drive that way again. And though the storm eventually passed, the fear never left her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again. The figure, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. She never spoke about what happened. It was as if it was better left forgotten. But deep down, she knew one thing for sure. The thing that had been in that room waiting for her hadn't been human. And it was still out there,